The 20 poorest nations in Africa will be the subject of this video. Before we proceed, click that subscribe button to watch more informative videos like this. First, we have a little analysis about poverty in Africa. Despite recent developments that have significantly reduced poverty worldwide, Africa has not experienced the same levels of success. Even though the COVID-19 pandemic didn't have as much of an impact on Africa in terms of infection rates and mortality as it did on Europe or the United States, the continent's already precarious economy suffered greatly, and over 30 million Africans, according to the Institute for Security Studies, fell into extreme poverty. Nearly 450 million Africans, or 34% of the continent's population, live below the poverty line, which was 9 times higher than the global average even before the pandemic's economic devastation. Because global advancements haven't trickled down to the continent, a sizable portion of the world's poorest nations are African. It's interesting to note that in 1981, Africa's rate of extreme poverty was 43.1%, which was comparable to the 42.8% global average. 34 years later, economic development and innovations brought the global rate down to about 6%, but Africa's rate only decreased to 35.5%, still more than 7 times the average. In the 1980s, Asia's Vietnam, Cambodia, and even China had poverty levels comparable to those in Africa, but while those nations' living standards dramatically improved, the same cannot be said for Africa, particularly the continent's poorest nations. On the other hand, some of Africa's most expensive nations have made progress in raising living standards. Despite these losses, Africa as a whole has tremendous future potential and a fantastic opportunity for investors. These nations could soon rank among the most developed in Africa if this development is achieved. The majority of the poorest countries in Africa still have room for significant growth, as evidenced by their 5-year GDP growth rates. Even while the wealthiest nations in the continent already have strong economies and modest growth rates. Using data from the World Bank, we calculated each country's GDP per capita and total GDP, giving the former 60% and the latter 40% weights, respectively, to identify the poorest nations in Africa. So let's now examine the nations that may have a bitter present but a possibly fantastic future, beginning with number 20. Congo. It has a total GDP per capita of $2,214. $12.5 billion is the country's total GDP. A lot needs to be done to raise the standard of living in a country whose economy is primarily dependent on agriculture and subsistence hunting, even though its GDP per capita isn't awful for an African country. Number 19. Democratic Republic of the Congo. The nation's overall GDP per individual is $584. $54 billion is the country's total GDP. All of the Democratic Republic of Congo's provinces are plagued by poverty, despite the fact that it is the second largest country in Africa and has access to resources with a market value in the billions of dollars. Number 18. Burkina Faso. It has a $918 GDP per person overall. The nation's entire GDP is $20 billion. A Sahelian nation, Burkina Faso's economy is primarily built on agriculture, but soaring gold exports are giving the nation, where 40% of the population lives below the poverty line, a much-needed boost. Number 17. Sudan. Total GDP per person in the nation, $764. The nation's entire GDP is $34 billion. Sudan's economy has been hampered by a lack of natural resources, and the government hasn't been able to shift the economy to other sectors like banking and technology. Number 16. Guinea. The nation's overall GDP per person is $1,174. The nation's entire GDP is $16 billion. Guinea is one of the poorest nations in Africa as a result of disparities between rural and urban areas and elite-level corruption. Number 15. Mali. The nation's overall GDP per person is $918. The nation's entire GDP is $19 billion. Mali has experienced food insecurity as a result of the country's severe and unpredictable climate, which has also contributed to violence and droughts damaging the economy of the country. Number 14. Eswatini. The nation's overall GDP per person is $4,215. $5 billion is the country's total GDP. Eswatini is a small landlocked nation that has experienced high price increases as a result of the Russian-Ukrainian conflict, a situation that was already precarious due to the prevalence of HIV and unemployment. Number 13. Seychelles. Countrywide total GDP per individual, $13,307. The nation's whole GDP is $1 billion. Although Seychelles has one of the most stunning economies in Africa, this comes with the drawback that the nation's economy is mostly dependent on tourism and was severely affected by the COVID-19 outbreak. It yet has the highest GDP per capita of any African nation. Number 12. Djibouti. The nation's overall GDP per person is $3,364. The nation's whole GDP is $3 billion. Despite having one of the greatest GDP per capita of any nation on our list of the poorest nations in Africa, Djibouti's economy still needs to grow significantly. This is because of a lack of resources. Number 11. Mauritania. The nation's overall GDP per person is $4,729. $12.2 billion is the country's total GDP. Despite the fact that Mauritania has a wealth of important resources, corruption has stopped the government from making the most of them, which has also deterred investment from Arab and European nations. Number 10. South Sudan. Its overall GDP per person is $1,120. $12 billion is the country's total GDP. Even though South Sudan has been a sovereign nation for more than 10 years, the nation has been beset by economic stagnation and insecurity ever since. Number 9. Cabo Verde. The nation's overall GDP per person is $3,446. $2 billion is the country's total GDP. Cabo Verde lacks significant natural resources, which could have given its economy a much-needed boost. 100 years ago, the country experienced catastrophic droughts that resulted in the deaths of about 200,000 people and the exodus of many others. As a result, the economy of the nation has since grown slowly. Number 8. Niger. The nation's overall GDP per person is $595. The nation's whole GDP is $15 billion. Niger is one of the poorest countries in Africa since more than 10 million of its people, more than 40% of the total population, live in poverty. Number 7. Malawi. Its overall GDP per person is $643. The nation's whole GDP is $13 billion. Even though Malawi has implemented significant structural and economic changes, its economy still relies heavily on agriculture and is therefore very susceptible to shocks from outside sources. Number 6. Mozambique. The nation's overall GDP per individual is $500. The nation's entire GDP is $16 billion. The World Bank claims that Mozambique must create a new economic model to address its poor productivity agricultural sector and reliance on significant extractive projects. Number 5. Togo. Its overall GDP per person is $992. $8 billion is the country's total GDP. Togo continues to be one of the poorest countries in Africa as a result of political instability, external debt, and commodity price volatility that have an impact on the country's economy. Number 4. Madagascar. Its overall GDP per person is $515. The nation's whole GDP is $15 billion. More than 70% of the population lives in poverty, despite the fact that the country is a sought-after tourist destination due to its natural beauty. Number 3. Rwanda. Its overall GDP per person is $834. The nation's whole GDP is $11 billion. Although Rwanda recovered remarkably well from the Rwandan genocide in 1994, its economic condition has not improved because a sizable portion of its economy is focused on agriculture. Number 2. Chad. Its overall GDP per person is $696. $12 billion is the country's total GDP. Due to its geographical location and harsh environment, Chad's economy has not developed, and more than half of the population lives in poverty. Number 1. São Tomé and Príncipe. The nation's overall GDP per person is $2,449. The nation's whole GDP is $1 billion. While São Tomé and Príncipe's economy has historically been centered on cocoa, investment in its oil industry is causing a revolution of its economy, and it currently ranks 17th on the continent in terms of GDP per capita. Share your opinions with us about the poverty in Africa. We love to hear from you. Also, if you are new to our channel, then make sure to subscribe before leaving. Thanks for watching.